Anaconda was in total control of the situation. This is now the second phase of this, from 1915 until it was bought out by Arco. In 1920, Anaconda was at its peak. It was the fourth largest company in the world at that time. But mining production gradually declined, and because what was happening was the mines were getting deeper. The ore quality was not as good as it went deeper, and it was more expensive to get the ore out. And so by the 1940s, Anaconda was concerned that the price of that copper was becoming too expensive to be able to sell, and the supply might be running out. They were very difficult to find, and the upper levels of these mines had been mined out. So the thought then was where there was exploration on the east side of Butte as to what the ore was like there. There had been some early mines there, and the finding was that the ore there was different. It was not in veins like on the west side. It was smaller veins closer together, couldn't economically mine it using traditional mining procedures, but it could be bulk mined. I'll have all of that ore and rock taken out and separated and then run through a concentrator and then smelted that way. So that thought initially led to the cave block mining and the Butte project, Greater Butte Project, which was announced in 1947. Okay, so Con Kelly was then the chairman of Anaconda. He had grown up in Butte and was a Butte folk hero. Supposedly, cave block mining would extend the life of mining in Butte. It would result in mining for many more years. And so they announced it in 1947. It took a while to get going. It was started in 1952 with production, and it ran until 1962. But the thing that occurred then was that, and this is at a time when apparently copper prices are still fairly low, there was further exploration done to the east of the block cave site in the area that the pit was started in, and it was found that there was this same type of copper, but it was closer to the surface, and it was possible to mine it with an open pit. The cave block mining is where the rock is blasted underground. This top part stays, and then the rock is drawn out in cars or up a shaft from underneath. In the open pit, obviously, it's mining in plain view with the shovels and the trucks, and ore comes out that way. So it turned out then that copper ore could be produced even more cheaply using open pit method than using cave block mining. And so the cave block mining was shut down in 1962, and by this time most of the underground mines had been shut down, leaving Butte with an open pit mine that could produce a tremendous quantity of ore. It would keep the smelter going, but it also produced a tremendous quantity of waste rock, which was then put up on the hill. Because the other thing that Anaconda had done was that beginning in the 1920s, it internationalized its mining operation. It bought mines in Chile and Mexico, huge open pit mines that could produce copper very cheaply, and Anaconda was at a point where its profitability came almost entirely from these international mines. And Butte then was sort of a second-class thing. They kept the mines going in Butte, but they were not probably competitive because it cost more to get the ore out than it could be sold for. And this is with the exception of the Berkeley Pit. Now, and along the way, Anaconda is trying to diversify. So What Anaconda did not really anticipate was the possibility that its Chile and Mexico mines might be nationalized. And they were both nationalized in 1971, which cut them off from Anaconda, cut off their profitability, left them with other properties which were not particularly profitable. There was new management that came in that represented banks and creditors of Anaconda, and their solution to that situation was to cut back and retrench and sell properties and close things. And that happened over a period of several years, including in Butte. And at the end of that process, by about 1976, all that the most valuable property that Anaconda had was a $300 million tax credit, which could be sold or used by somebody else who acquired it. So there were a couple of takeover attempts which were unsuccessful. And then ARCO came along and bought Anaconda for $760 million in cash and stock for reasons that were never clearly stated. The best thought was people wrote in the business journals that the reason why ARCO bought Anaconda was because of this $300 million tax credit, or it had some coal properties that ARCO might want to get into. But ARCO had no experience in mining. It was a large oil company, a very large, successful oil company. It had no relationship or loyalty to people in Butte, particularly, and but there they were. So, and again, the copper prices continued to be low. So, there was an issue. So then along comes the Clean Air Act, which was enacted in 1970, but was begun to be enforced, and there was concern as to whether the smelter in Anaconda would meet environmental standards. And there was negotiation between ARCO and Montana officials and Washington officials. They were willing to waive or extend deadlines for compliance with environmental requirements. But this smelter was old, and it was dirty, and it was not efficient, and it was going to have to be replaced sooner or later, probably, with costing $20 or $30 million to replace it. So what ARCO decided to do then was to close the smelter. In February of 1980, there was a possibility that it might do it, but by October of 1980, they did it with no warning at all to the people of Anaconda, leaving over 1,000 smelter workers unemployed all of a sudden. They just shut down the smelter, leaving Butte with a concentrator that could produce concentrated ore, which was shipped to Japan to smelt. Now, there was an investigation. The EPA decided to do an investigative report of what had happened, because Anaconda claimed that it was the EPA and the environmentalists that made them close. And the EPA investigated this. They had a hearing. They got comments from people, and they said that no, it really wasn't. That might have been a factor, but it wasn't really the cause. And let's see, 4-22. Okay, we're now talking about an EPA report that was issued in 1981 after the smelter closed. And the report concluded that although the Clean Air Act requirements played a role in the assessment of the smelter's viability, they were not the overwhelming or even most important factor leading to its decision. Instead, a host of economic factors contributed to the smelter being a marginal operation, even in the absence of environmental controls. and that the smelter was marginal operation, might not have been viable long term. It was high operating costs, energy intensive, underutilization of smelter capacity, and the fact that ARCO could get a good deal from Japanese smelters on the price charged for smelting, because at that time Japanese smelters had excess capacity. So we move into an economic thing. But so ARCO got a good deal temporarily on smelting the concentrate in Japan, closed down the smelter in Anaconda, and then they decided to close the pit, Berkeley Pit, in April of 1982, closed the Kelly mine, turned off the water pumps, and that's what led to the flooding, everything underground being flooded, and the Berkeley Pit Lake getting started. But there's that chapter, and then, but before that, there's the question of the Berkeley Pit's expansion and its effect on Butte's neighborhoods and the people of Butte. And I talk about that in chapter 5. There were a number of Butte neighborhoods that were well established. They started from the very early days. When the Irish miners first came to Butte, they lived in Dublin Gulch and Corktown, and when the Alice mine started, there were homes in Walkerville, and then the Italians came and they lived in Meaderville, and there were McQueen and East Butte and the East Side, and I go into that in some detail. I thought it was worthwhile to preserve a description of what those neighborhoods were like in the beginning. They were strong communities. They were ethnically, sometimes a lot of them were Catholic, either Irish or Italian, or the Serbians were Serbian Orthodox, but there was a mix of cultural, religious, social networks that made those neighborhoods very strong. And as over time, the details of which I can't get into, but the pit expanded, and that was all wiped out. And the result was that those people were all displaced. They had to sell their homes to Anaconda to get out, and they were able, I guess, mostly to move into the south side of Flat in Butte, but it wasn't the same. The cohesive neighborhoods were no longer there. The Walkerville, but there was not just the Berkeley Pit. Anaconda had several smaller ones, and including one, the Alice Pit in Walkerville. And there, Walkerville decided to fight. Jimmy Shea and the council in Walkerville opposed the pit because it was causing damage to the streets and sidewalks in Walkerville and damage to the residents of Walkerville. And so they forced the Anaconda to get permits for what they were doing. In response, Anaconda shut down the pit, and people were unemployed. But eventually, the Walkerville was successful in stopping the Alice Pit. And maybe Anaconda says, well, there wasn't that much ore in there anyway, and they were going to quit anyway. But the Alice Pit stopped. Meaderville tried to stop the Berkeley Pit, was unsuccessful. And I'm driving up Harrison today, looking at the hill, and it's just really amazing to me now to see it's all just dirt and reclaimed material, and all the houses and businesses and everything are gone. So there was also, we were talking about this earlier, the issue of would the pit expand into the Uptown Business District? Concern about there were possibilities that the whole town might be swallowed up. There was also concern that Uptown was deteriorating, and it should move. It should go to Stodden Park, or it should go to a couple of other locations. So there was an episode in 1975-76 where the Butte City Council had to deal with the question of whether the uptown should be moved, if of the fear that the pit might expand, and Anaconda was really not willing to disclose what their plans were. It was unknown what their plans were. But the way that turned out was that the city council eventually voted to not move, to keep the uptown where it was, and Anaconda did not move the pit any further to the west. And at that point, I think, from what I've read, maybe you can tell me if I'm mistaken, but there was a greater willingness in Butte citizens and organizations to be more assertive in reclaiming the uptown and doing more here, and being more resistive to the Anaconda Company. And that has led to efforts now to revitalize Uptown Butte, including the building in which we are now sitting. So, I've probably gone on longer than I had intended. And there's a lot more in here, but you get kind of the general drift. But, you come back to then the question that I started out with, now that you know all of that history, and you can see that what Butte is the result of everything that's happened here. Where do you go from here? What's the next step? Many mining towns have just withered away and died. Once the mines are gone, there's no reason for the town to continue, and people leave and people die, and it becomes a ghost town. Now, Butte's declined in population, but it's stabilized, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years, 30 to 35,000 people. But can Butte grow, or in what direction should it grow, or how should it do it, or who should be in charge? Where's the leadership? And to me, I just say in the book that's unclear. I don't know the answer to that. I've talked with several people since I've been here this time who are influential in the community, who are in a position to be leaders in future change, and I'm not sure that they've really thought about that in the sense of really being willing to do anything specific to move forward. So that is, I guess, and I've discussed this with the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce, who is very interested in promoting something and using the book to encourage future development. And I guess that's my hope here, is that the knowledge of the past will help shape the future and will have something to do with that, and that would be a very good thing. So I think I've talked long enough. I probably exceeded the capacity of the recording. And thank you for letting me do this, and I appreciated your attention. Thank you.